Welcome, everyone. The Center of Excellence in Smart Construction is pleased to present this virtual joint webinar en route to COP28, Navigating the Legal Challenges of Sustainable and Smart Construction Innovations. My name is Dr. Wendu Oguda, and I'm the manager of the Center of Excellence in Smart Construction. Please note, we're recording this webinar and all lines are muted. If you need help at any time, please send us a message via the Q&A chat box. Today's event will last up to 60 minutes. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the event. Simply type them into the Q&A chat box in the lower center of the screen, and then be sure to click the send button. We would like to acknowledge our 6 partners who have been integral to the development of the center and our engagement with industry. We would also like to acknowledge our ongoing relationships with our affiliates and our ongoing relationships with our strategic alliances. I would now like to briefly introduce you to our esteemed academic and industry panel. Dr. Marlene Muller is an associate professor in leadership at Heraud University. And this is a joint webinar between Heraud University Center of Excellence in Smart Construction and Tamimi and Company. So I'd like to introduce our industry colleagues from Tamimi. We've got Francis Patalong, who is the senior counsel, Sarah Aranyo, who is a partner, and Ahmed Saleh, who is a partner and head of 3IP. Full bios of all our panelists are available in the invitation that was sent out previously. I'll now hand you over to our moderator, Dr. Marlene Muller. Over to you, Dr. Marlene.
Thanks, Nwendo. It's indeed a great privilege to be surrounded by so many inspirational individuals, making my life as a moderator exceptionally rewarding and easy, I would say. Keeping our focus set on the upcoming COP28, we will conduct our discussions around 4 main topics and their intersectionality. So it will be sustainability, smart construction, innovation, and then, of course, legal challenges. So Francis will kickstart our session, presenting his take on regional developments when pushing for net zero, as linked to financial reporting and stranded assets. But before we start, I just want to repeat what Nwendo said earlier. If we can just all switch off our mics and cameras, except for Francis, of course. Also be reminded that you can add your comments and questions in the Q&A chat box so that we can cover them later. And of course, given that none of us can ever win the battle against the clock, we will follow quite a strict schedule. Our presentation and panel discussion will last around 30 minutes, followed by a 15 minutes Q&A, but I think we will make it, so no worries. Okay, so without any further delay, please welcome our guest speaker, Francis Patalong.
Thanks, Marlene. Can we move on to the slides? Great. Well, thanks, Marlene and Wendy, for the invitation. It's a privilege to be with you here today, talking about this exceptionally important topic. It's going to dominate a lot of our professional lives for the next year and indefinitely, I suspect, after that. Can we move on to the next slide, please? There's the heading. And I think my job in this short presentation is to signpost some topics of conversation for the panel discussion later on, so I shall try and do that I promised to lay some pipes for other people to pick up the conversation later on. So let's move on to the next slide, please. It's always a good question to ask yourself before you start on one of these sorts of presentations. I'm not going to roll through my CV, but what I wanted to indicate is that my sort of journey in relation to ESG has been quite a long one. I'm starting off with my first job out of university, but the big thing that I wanted to pick on was in the 1990s, I worked on a coal-fired power station in Southern Africa, in Botswana, or ESCOM, who are the local power utility. And it was during that period I really kind of equipped myself with an appreciation of the realities of climate change and the science behind it. And you know, that's what convinced me not to be a skeptic, shall we say. And I tried very, very hard at that point. But I mean, I think there's some very, very interesting conversations going on at the moment, arising from the COP27 in Egypt around loss and damage. And certainly there are voices in the global south who quite rightly, I think, are demanding a fair say in terms of how we spend our remaining carbon budget. So I think that's something we need to bear in mind when we go through. And everybody has their own sort of trajectory when they come to these sorts of issues. And it's certainly something I know that the guys at the Smart Construction Department at Heriot-Watt have looked at in some detail. So let's move on to the next slide, please. The other concept that I really wanted to embed at the start was something to do with stranded assets. And basically a stranded asset is something that was of value that's had its value eroded for various reasons. And one of the risks that I perceive that we're confronted with in terms of climate change and in particular the shift to net zero is if we're not careful, we end up with several categories of assets which have had their value almost totally eroded or will do over the fullness of time. And that has a bearing on businesses' balance sheets, their profitability, their ability to raise capital. And it's something we're going to come back to. So one of the things that I wanted to get people thinking about today was the concept of what a stranded asset is and how climate change and the march to net zero might impact on that. And it's certainly something where I think leadership is important. So bear that in mind, and we'll get some more meat in a while. And the next slide, please. This is my take on what's happened during the pandemic. I think as a lawyer, the pandemic was a very, very interesting period because it made people stop and consider things. And one of the initiatives that was launched during the pandemic was something called the Chancery Lane Project, which is all about taking the concept of net zero and laying it into actual contract drafting. And that only really came about, I suspect, because people were given a bit of breathing space during the pandemic. So some good things did come out of that period. I would say that business as usual approach is not sustainable for any business. And certainly Tamimi, as a law firm, has had a long, hard look at what we're doing in terms of our own sustainability efforts, both in terms of our practices and how we conduct business. I think it's fair to say that sentiment has changed across all sectors and segments of the markets, and opportunities and threats are becoming hardwired. So this is a clear and present danger for companies, and they're going to be hit in two directions. They're going to be hit by a wave of increased regulation and law, and they're also going to be hit by counterparties who are driven to innovate by the challenge of net zero, want to see that innovation realize return on investment, and are therefore going to be very, very keen to make sure that they retain that competitive advantage. So this is going to bring with it a whole raft of requirements for protecting innovation and investment, and also litigating where things go wrong. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that's going to impact, I suspect, in terms of raising capital later on. So if we click onto the next slide, please. So what is net zero? You know, I'm sure most people on this call probably are familiar with the concept, and what I've got there is the IPCC definition, which was driven by the Paris Agreement. It's basically getting to a position where emissions of greenhouse gases are balanced over a specified time period. And companies and countries are setting net zero targets, some of which are very ambitious, some of which could be more ambitious, shall we say, and we'll have a look at a few of those presently. In terms of emissions, people will be familiar with something called scoping, as scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Scope 1 emissions would be direct from facilities run by business, scope 2 would be indirect, and scope 3 would be emissions derived from goods purchased and services delivered. They're outside the direct control of the party. I'm reading that there are now scope 4 and scope 5. They seem to be adding scopes, but that's the kind of narrative that we're in relation to net zero. So just to recap, we've got this concept of a stranded asset. We know that things are changing. We know what net zero means. If we move on to the next slide, we can start looking at some regional developments. Now, I'm not going to go through this in any kind of exhaustive detail, but what I thought would be helpful for people is to have a look and see what's going on in our region across the various kind of headings of ESG. So in the first column there, you've got climate change and net zero commitments. Then you're looking at sustainable finance, social laws and policies. That's more the S of ESG, and governance is clearly the G of ESG. And all these things are working together. My particular entry point into this, as I said earlier, is very much on the climate side of the discourse, but I know there are people out there who are particularly interested in, for example, the social side. And when I speak to people in the ESG community about net zero, there's quite often quite a lot of emphasis in terms of a just transition, as well as actually addressing the climate issues. They want to see some equity injected into that. And that was certainly a theme of the COP27 conclusions in Sharm el-Sheikh, where they started looking at loss and damage in some detail. So we can see what's going on. Bahrain, Egypt. If we go to the next slide, there we have Iraq. Iraq's just acceded to the Paris Agreement. Israel, they've got a net zero target by 2050. You can see what Jordan is doing. If you move on to the next slide, we'll get into some of the bigger jurisdictions, perhaps. Here's KSA, where I'm sitting in Riyadh. Our net zero targets for 2060. There's a national renewable energy program to be 50% by 2030. That's consistent with the Vision 2030. That's a big program of the government in Saudi Arabia. There's a big move that sits behind that to de-emphasize hydrocarbons from the economy. They want to diversify to make sure that the economy is not just about hydrocarbons and hydrocarbon-derived products, which is why you have some of the fantastic giga projects that are being launched here as tourism and sustainability and so on. There's very active Saudi stock market here, which is talking about ESG disclosure guidelines and so on. So there's a huge amount going on in the ESG space in Saudi Arabia. And again, it all goes back to net zero, and underlying that, I think, is this concern that we don't want to end up with stranded assets. We want something that's going to preserve and create value in the future. So moving on quickly, let's see what's going on in the next slide, please. Morocco. We've recently taken on an office in Morocco as Tamimi, so if you're interested in that jurisdiction. Let's go to the last slide, please, because then we've got the UAE. And again, you can see that the UAE's got a net zero target. Obviously, COP28 is taking place in Abu Dhabi later this year. There's been a huge amount of work done by the likes of Masdar and so on in ESG in formulating their own sorts of sustainability standards. I know that it's something they're looking at in the construction industry in particular, and there is talk of some green standards being introduced there. So that canter through what's going on regionally is just to give you a flavour, really, for how active government is in all of this. And I think it's fair to say that this region is in the process of catching up with some of the other regions, in particular the EU, which appears to be a sort of bit of a gold standard in terms of taking these sorts of leads. But it will catch up, and it will accelerate its commitment to sustainability and ESG. So what does that mean? So we know that on one side of the equation, we've got government looking at these things. We know that it's driven by international treaties. We know that the Paris Climate Agreement talks about net zero. And we know there's a lot of government stuff going on. If we move on to the next slide, I think what's really interesting, and this was something that was announced at the COP before Egypt in Glasgow, is the emergence of kind of gold standard international financial reporting standards. So the International Sustainability Standards Board was established around the COP in Glasgow. And basically, if you want to raise finance, green finance, you are going to have to subscribe to certain sustainability disclosures. And it's going to give investors, I think, a clear set of parameters against which they can measure the credibility and investability of any particular investment. And given the amount of projects that are going on in the region, it's very, very important that investments are made credibly. If the return is based on achieving a certain KPI in relation to a sustainability standard, then you want to make sure that you've got the wherewithal to make sure that it's something that's auditable, measurable, and achievable. So these sorts of standards are going to become very, very important. They're becoming very, very important to businesses who want to raise finance. And again, it goes back to, well, what is your business saying it's going to do in relation to net zero? There will be people out there who are going to audit you. They're going to come and they're going to look at you. They're going to scrutinize what you say you're doing and what you actually do. And it's going to result in litigation. It's going to result in disputes. And that's already happening. Actually, there's been some cases in Europe around that. Moving on to the next slide, please. So I mentioned at the get-go that the legal community had not taken the pandemic off. The group of lawyers in London, in particular on a pro bono basis, started something called the Chancery Lane Project. And that was all about taking this concept of net zero and seeing how you could plumb that into the kind of contracts that Ahmed, Sarah, and I typically deal with on a day-to-day basis. And what this group did on a pro bono basis was they sat down and they drafted, getting on for 200 separate clauses that can be used as part of a suite of standard form documentation or bolted in bespoke fashion to deal with the achievement of net zero. It's a monumentally impressive effort, which is now being rolled out globally. And we're involved in some of the transposition exercises locally in each of the jurisdictions in which we operate. And we're hoping to be doing a lot more on that in the coming year in the run up to COP28. I would say it's a very, very good exercise. It's an exercise that involves top-class law firms. It also involves something called peer review, which means that each of the clauses that's originated here is something that's subject to review by other lawyers. So it's drafting that's been tested in earnest, and I think it's going to become the bedrock of future contracting and therefore future disputes. One of the things it also looks at is how you conduct disputes in a green manner, and how you actually conduct the business of law, which I think is particularly interesting from our perspective. There is, on the Chancery Lane website, which I think there's a link to later on. If there's not, we can get you one. If you get these slides, that link on there will actually work. There's a whole section on buildings and land, including property construction, environment and planning. There's probably around 30 clauses on there, I would say. The whole set of them are worth a look. And I think in terms of actionable items in coming away from this talk today, if you go and talk to your in-house counsel, general counsel, what have you, and say, are you aware of this? You should go and have a look at it. What are we doing about net zero? What is our net zero aspiration, I think it's going to give you a great deal of food for thought. It's certainly something I'd be delighted to carry on a conversation with anybody who wants after. Moving on, I've got a couple of slides now from the Chancery Lane project themselves. This is lifted from an introductory slideshow, which is on their website, explaining what the set of resources is on there that you can access and look at, and it will give you some idea for the complexity that's been achieved in a relatively short period of time. And I think, you know, this is something that's going to become increasingly mainstream. I think one of the challenges with ESG and sustainability is that organizations tend to view it in a bit of a silo. And certainly what we've done at Tamimi is try and mainstream the issue to get everybody in every single one of our practice areas thinking about it. And tools like this Net Zero Toolkit have certainly helped us in actioning that. If you go on to the next slide, please, you'll see where some of these clauses are being used in terms of the contractual life cycle. You'll see they've all got names. They're named after the children of the person who originated the clause, which I think is quite a nice touch, given that this is concerning net zero and the health of the planet and so on. But there are some really, really hard provisions in here. I mean, it's not airy-fairy stuff. I mean, it's serious contract drafting, and I'd recommend that you go and have a look at them and peruse them, you know, in slightly slower time. So moving on, please. This is a list of some of the sorts of clauses which I think might be of particular interest to people on this call. Things like the circular economy product design obligation. That's basically saying to your supply chain, you go off and make sure that when you're designing things for us, it's got a net zero impact. So it's actually letting you manage your net zero aspiration in your supply chain. It's giving you a tool with which you can police that in terms of your subcontractors. Likewise, net zero obligations in FIDIC engineering, procurement, construction contracts. Debt finance clauses promoting sustainable water usage. So a key element of any project in this region is water usage and power. Where are you getting your power from? How can we make sure that this is used sustainably? These are all sorts of issues that I think people are going to have to start grappling with business to business. So there was that set of examples earlier on that I showed you about what government is doing and the new laws and initiatives that are being promulgated. This is a toolkit here through which businesses can start communicating to each other their own net zero aspirations and trying to police them. So I think it's particularly exciting and something that people should be looking at in earnest. So the next clause, please. In parallel with initiatives coming from government and things like the Chancery Lane project and the reporting standards that are being led by the International Reporting Financial Standards Board, you've got science-based initiatives. These have been around for some time, I think. I mean, BREEAM and LEED are well understood. You know, they've been embedded in the construction industry for a number of years. Science-based targets, I think, is something slightly newer, and it's something that we're even seeing in the law. I mean, I'm aware of law firms who are adopting science-based targets in relation to net zero. And there's an organisation which I came across the other day called B Corp, which appears to be operating a kind of assurance program whereby people can kind of volunteers become, you know, accredited as an organisation in respect of their sustainability initiatives. So there's a whole kind of web of people out there who want to validate what your efforts are, but it's going to come down to auditing and actually walking the talk, and that's a challenge of leadership I think, as much as anything else, and leadership is got to be pointed in this direction. So if I tell you a little bit, just to wrap up, about what Tamimi has been doing. Next slide, please. We kind of kicked this off in earnest probably 4 years ago. We had a questionnaire that we sent around to our offices to find out what people were doing. We periodically do a climate edition of our Law Update periodical magazine. We have an ESG group. We updated our CSI criteria to talk about sustainability. We're involved with Chancery Lane. And we're also involved with something called Lawyers for Net Zero, which is an in-house council organisation. So as a practice, we feel that we are playing a part. There's always room for improvement. There's always more to do. And I think with COP28, we're determined to play a major role in that on behalf of the legal industry, and also for our kind of clients and sectors. And we're trying to do this across practices, sectors, and jurisdictions. We're not looking to make this a kind of silo of corporate social responsibility. We see this as a theme which is going to drive a lot of growth in future, particularly, I would think, in relation to the kind of work that Ahmed does in terms of innovation, and also increasingly, I think, in terms of manifesting in disputes resolution, and how people are going to start arguing about these sorts of issues. It's like having a new language to speak in some respects, net zero, and people are going to argue about it, and they're going to want to protect their innovations and so on. So that's my sermon over. I hope I'm on time. Marlene, final slide, please. I just wanted to give you a couple of my favourite quotes to generate some discussion. I think we're beyond maybe the first one. I think everybody understands the imperative on net zero. I think the thing that business is grappling with at the moment is, well, how do we wrap our arms around this, and how do we do this? And maybe the thing that's missing is the kind of business to business dialogue and policing. And I think there is some hope out there in terms of how that might shape up. So that was it from me. I'm happy to participate and take questions later. Over to you, Marlene.
Thank you so much, Francis. I'm sure the audience will agree with us that the governments are definitely moving into the right direction, and they most surely support innovation and research so that we can not only reach our targets, but also the science-based targets. That's the latest trends. I'm going to ask the panelists now to share their thoughts. We have lost a little bit of minutes, but we also scored a little bit. So, that's life. So well done, Francis, for keeping us within the time frames. My first question to the panel will be, what excites you about COP28 pertaining innovation and our sustainable initiatives? So I'm going to pass over to Ahmed, our innovator and IP expert. Ahmed, what are your thoughts on COP28 innovation and the sustainable initiatives? I'm going to give you 3 minutes. Okay, if that's okay.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for organizing this very important event, first of all. And thanks, Francis, for your very insightful presentation. Well, first of all, I'm very excited that COP28 is taking place in the United Arab Emirates. I think that our leadership is taking a very proactive role globally in order to push the ESG agenda on the global level. Today, I was actually attending an event in Abu Dhabi organized by Sanduq al-Watan. And His Highness Sheikh Nahyan bin Mubarak Al Nahyan, we were lucky to have him to present his keynote speech today. And it was focusing actually on sustainability, and actually pushing all the key stakeholders in the United Arab Emirates, from entrepreneurs to academia, to universities, to businesses, to push the ESG agenda forward, to work in a sustainable manner, to push innovations forward, to support innovation and entrepreneurship in this sector, for the importance it presents not only for the UAE, but for the global community. And we know very well that our leadership here in the UAE is very keen into that. Now, what excites me, first of all, is all the leadership our governments are taking into that and pushing the international agenda forward, first of all. And second, all the opportunities it presents, not only from the business perspective, of course, attracting foreign direct investment inside the country, for all the initiatives that are being taken here, from developing new innovations, new technologies, driving business, getting all the business drive force inside the country to push this agenda, but also the impact we will leave on the humanity globally, for all, the impact in reducing the toxic emissions, including carbon dioxide and other toxic gases, not to forget. So this is what excites me the most, and what actually drives me among the key things which drives me every day to work.
Thank you very much. I'm really impressed. There was 13 seconds left to spare. Sarah, your thoughts on COP28 and sustainable initiatives?
Thank you very much once again for this very kind invitation on such an important topic, which is also quite timely in light of the upcoming events that we are having here and witnessing in the Middle East region. I would start off by saying, that the initiatives to drive and showcase commitment to climate change, such as the COP28, as Francis alluded to in his presentation, are extremely important in our region, but these also are equally quite new. And so, when you look at the historically fossil-driven economy that we have here, and it does require additional efforts from a government perspective to try and drive and to shift often what has been relied on for not only many years, but also many centuries. And so, the UAE's commitment now to decarbonization is ongoing. And there is definitely, as my colleague Ahmed has said, and really a national drive and a commitment to drive net zero emissions. So when you look at it from a disputes perspective, and I'm talking more generally about international disputes, because often that would involve an international party doing or transacting business somewhere here in the Middle East, and often that would entail a government or a government-affiliated entity. And so when you look at that from a perspective of a dispute settlement, and we will get the opportunity to sort of discuss certain forms of dispute resolution mechanisms and what impact they would entail in the context of that fast-moving ecosystem, I think I will maybe make an analogy and maybe invite you all to consider that, as ironic as this may sound, but the COVID-19 pandemic has had a positive bearing on driving and pushing the manner in which cross-border disputes are conducted in the MENA region. And that has pushed us to adopt more or less, I would say, positive approaches and conducts to the manner in which, for example, we conduct hearings. And if I could leave you maybe just in the interest of time with a very telling statistic. There's an initiative called the Campaign for Greener Arbitration. And that campaign, in a very recent study, has revealed that almost 20,000 trees could be required to offset carbon emissions from one single arbitration. And that is obviously a staggering figure that does demonstrate the need to adopt more sustainable practices in our day-to-day lives and in our practices. And that simply means, I guess, quite fortunately, maybe one of the silver lining of the COVID pandemic, not to necessarily have to fly over for very basic procedural meetings, etc. So I would leave it at that for now, Marlene, and I'm happy to touch upon more of other initiatives and means to resolve disputes in that context.
Indeed, COVID was positive pertaining to the saving of Mother Earth in many instances, right? Francis, I'm going to throw this also to you. What makes you excited about COP28?
Well, I think the correct response to climate change is terror and boredom, actually. So I'm excited that it's going to be happening again in this region. I mean, I think it's an excellent opportunity for folks in the UAE to really showcase what they have been doing, because I think to the rest of the world, this region is a region of hydrocarbon producers, and the profile of what's been done here isn't heard sufficiently loudly. So I think there is a number of good things going on here, but it needs to accelerate. So I think that's number one. I mean, I think this region has a good story to tell, but we're all part of a common species, and it's a species level set of issues. So I think there needs to be further progress. I think there's a lot of emphasis being placed regionally on carbon capture and storage, which has to be profoundly hopeful that that's going to work and it's going to be scalable, and it's going to help ameliorate some of the problems. But it doesn't alter the fact that there are smaller things that everybody can be doing, which plays to the strengths of initiatives like Chancery Lane, like sustainability reporting standards. There's a number of other smaller things that we should be doing, and given some agency to do in our day-to-day lives, which is where I think you guys in terms of smart construction can play a role. I mean, I think we're very, very nearly at the point where our houses, our dwellings, our offices should be more acutely conscious of the power burden and water usage that we're actually using, and that's pretty exciting. So I think I think there's tremendous source for optimism, and I think the UAE showed with Expo that it could put on a globally significant event. I think this is slightly different to Expo in that we need to have some pretty tough things coming out of it. And some of the conversations that were started in Sharm el-Sheikh around loss and damage, I think in particular, are going to be quite interesting. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask you a second question, and maybe Francis, we can start with you. Given that innovation should be smart driven, it should be driven by technology, and it should be future fit, and it should still be successful in creating value. How do you think can we address the issues of stranded assets? Because I think that's a huge concern for you and your company.
Well, it's a concern for everybody. I mean, if you look at what we would have as a stranded asset, I suppose, conceptually, it might be a precedent that doesn't work in the context of a net zero environment anymore. Something that people no longer want. That is what a stranded asset is. And I think it's incumbent on business leaders to be looking at what they've got in their inventory and what they're planning to create, and testing it against the new reality of living in a net zero world. Because if they don't do that, I think pretty rapidly that change is going to be upon them. I mean, I think everybody is going to have that kind of, and I'll show my age here, sort of Betamax VHS moment where you've got different formats and one will win. Well, the net zero one has won. I mean, that's the kind of sea change that we're going through here. So whether the asset is a physical asset, a building or what have you, or it's an intellectual asset, I think its ability to subscribe to kind of net zero values is going to be pretty critical. So that's where your stranded asset kind of concept comes in, and I think that process is going to accelerate. So I think it's very, very interesting one to try and manage, because of course for every innovation that comes up in that sector, another lithium mine has to be opened somewhere. We for every electric car that we have, somebody has to make the electricity and find a wherewithal to create the batteries. So it's a bit of a web of moral hazard, I suppose, and companies are going to have to become more adept at navigating that, particularly, I think, if they're going to be making claims in their prospectuses about their green credentialing and sustainability and so on. So does that answer your question, Marlene? I hope so. It starts to.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much. Ahmed, as an IP expert, what do you think are the consequences of stranded assets for the innovator out there?
Well, the good news about innovation is that it doesn't discriminate between industries or between opportunities. So it applies to all opportunities equally. And if we look at the agenda, at the national strategy, net zero strategy of the UAE, you will notice that the national strategy, yes, it sets a very ambitious, objective for 2050. However, it comes in a progressive manner. So meaning that we don't wait until the 2050 to start applying the different activities and the different actions in order to reduce our emissions. However, it already started, and it's going on today, tomorrow, next year, and so on. And it's a progressive plan, and therefore this plan is also set to take into consideration these assets, and that, for example, and I don't have the details, I don't memorize the details by heart. However, for example, as an example, within the next couple of years, the agenda said that we need to transform all, light vehicles into electric vehicles. And this is coming up soon. I mean, so we're not waiting until 2050 to have the light vehicles, to eliminate the old technology fuel-driven cars and replace them by electric cars. It's coming up within the next 10 years, I trust. So the plan takes already into consideration what we do with the old assets, and innovation. Actually, for innovators, it's good news is that they don't only need to work on new technologies which reduce carbon dioxide and other toxic gases, but also to apply innovation on how to deal with these old assets that are today a liability on humanity. For example, the pipelines which are used in oil extraction plants, for example. What do we do with that? And there are already thoughts on what we can do with this. Maybe we can apply them to transport, all the toxic gases from using the blue hydrogen. So there are already thoughts on how we can use this, and innovators are already thinking across these lines. I'm really not worried about that from the innovation perspective. Wherever there are opportunities, you will find innovators there going into these niche areas and applying innovation in order to address issues, to solve problems, and to benefit from the economic perspective, first of all, business perspective, and which will socially impact as well our environment and our sustainability agenda.
Thank you, Ahmed. Sarah, I know there are different trends out there for green lawyers and green litigation and all of that. If you could maybe just enlighten us a little bit to show the audience how we can mitigate all these tricky issues of stranded assets and innovation per se.
Yeah, I guess, the main challenge is going to be, if I tell you like 6 years ago or 7 years ago, you would have spoken to any decision maker of an organization, you would have asked them, what they were doing to mitigate, or in terms of actions that would be affiliated to climate change. And I guess 90 or 95% of the time, the answer would have been a silent one or a negative one, or they would have probably been very dismissive of you. But now, basically, if you pause that same question again, well, for the most part, I think, when you look at countries like the United States or certain jurisdictions in Europe, well, I think, those same decision makers or directors, they would probably tell you that, if they don't factor in those obligations, then they're pretty much sort of failing their own fiduciary duties or responsibilities. And so if we take a step back and look sort of at the nature and the spirit of contractual obligations in the helm of construction disputes. And you would add to it, I guess, a layer of complexity, meaning you're embedding into it ESG-related clauses. So looking, at the first layer, meaning construction disputes, plain vanilla construction disputes. And so they are, by essence, involving complex contracts with various stakeholders, clients, subcontractors, suppliers. And so often the failure to meet contractual obligations related to, if you once you add an additional layers such as, a ESG clauses to it, or ESG reporting requirements, that can lead obviously inevitably to further heightened disputes, because that would mean that your exposure or likelihood of committing a contractual breach is now much more significant. But also by the same token, that would also mean and would raise inevitably issues such as valuation, because when you're talking as well about quantifying damages in the context of a dispute or primarily in the context of arbitration, you are actually, for the most part, seeking a declaration, but also translating often that declaration in terms of a monetary value. And I can see, at least from what I can tell from the very, very early stages, waves of climate change disputes that we are seeing from this side of the world, that, issues of valuation of damages are going to be quite tricky, particularly when you bring those and you marry those with certain sets of legal regimes, such as the civil law embedded regimes that are predominantly applicable here in the region. It's going to create, on one hand, certain hurdles or challenges, but on the other side, I could see as well the creation of more innovative ways and probably a new wave of experts to become more creative of how to go around these.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Sarah. My last question before we open up the floor for the audience. How can we embed a sense of urgency among key role players, right? 1.5 degrees and, climate change, El Nino in one of Francis' slides. That's quite a passionate topic for him. So how can we embed a sense of urgency among the key role players? Because it seems that COP27, 26 and the potential COP28, they do struggle a little bit to bring in equality and the question of debt and loss as well. Francis, I'll start with you.
I just want to pick up and highlight something Sarah said. I think she's quite right. 6 or 7 years ago, if you'd asked somebody in the region about any of these issues, they would have looked at you quite blankly and what do you want about? It's now ratcheted up to be the top issue that General Counsel are looking at. And I know this because I speak to an organisation called Lawyers for Net Zero, who tell me this. That's a group of in-house counsel based in the UK and Europe who are looking at these issues. Leadership is what's required. I mean, I think people on this call are interested. They require a certain amount of bloody mindedness to actually have some impact in their organisations. A certain amount of resilience, tenacity, passion about the subject. That's what's required. All of the wherewithal, all of the knowledge is out there. We know what we have to do. The people running the COPs know what we have to do. It's just making sure that the thing actually happens and giving people some agency to do that. So I think, in terms of instilling urgency, we need leaders. We need people who are prepared to stick their heads above the parapet and act passionately, sensibly, about it, and with a degree of measure as well. I mean, I think there is reason to be optimistic. I mean, we know what the problem is, but that I think is essential. I mean, I think there's been a lot of talk. You can attend these sorts of sessions around sustainability and ESG. They're proliferating at the moment, obviously, in the run-up to COP28. The key thing is taking away from this some actionable points. And it may be that you go back and you speak to your general counsel and say, what's this Chancery Lane stuff? What are these international financial reporting standards? What's this green mitigation business? What's all that about? Go away and ask some questions. I think that's what I would say.
Okay, thank you so much. Ahmed, 1 minute.
To create a sense of urgency, honestly, if you want my frank opinion, if you want to speak about the humans, about the humanity, days and nights, I mean, we've seen this through the history since thousands of years, and it's not gonna move them. I mean, at the end of the day, I think what's gonna move them is a couple of important things. One, of course, they need to see an example. So leadership is very important, and I think mentioned by Francis. Second is you gotta show them opportunities. And we live in a world where it's driven by interest. And when you show them opportunities, and a better lives for them, from the business perspective, from the ecological perspective, from the different perspectives, is gonna drive them. So, and I'm very, very optimistic that that ESG presents all the right opportunities, from the business opportunities, the economic opportunities, the growth opportunities, the better lives opportunities. It presents all the opportunities possible, and as a consequence, I'm very optimistic that it creates a sense of kind of motivation for innovators, for businesses, for governments, and for education institutions, research institutions, to drive them and to put them forward.
Thank you so much. I think I will conclude this panel discussion for a bit, and we're going to move over to the audience. We have 2 questions there. Sarah, I'm going to forward the one to you. The first question from Anonymous is, are net zero requirements and clauses included in standard forms of contracts? And how is the ambiguity around net zero terminology addressed? It's in the Q&A box, if you would like to just reread that, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you to whoever posed these 2 questions, which are, quite, important in terms of practical challenges. So I'll probably start off with the second question, which is how do we sort of, balance out the fact that you're adding a complexity from a contractual perspective, and how do you sort of iron out any issues of ambiguity? And I would say by that, the best way of going around that is to engage in clean, simple drafting. And so I guess in these instances, less is often more. So really adopt the rule of thumb by, being clear. And maybe in terms of addressing now the second question, I would say, there are different initiatives, guidelines that are also out there, including standard or template clauses. So these can serve as a means of, at least getting you started to where you're headed. And I would like to maybe, and given that we're in the context of the very important sector and industry of construction, maybe to refer some of the audience today to the FIDIC. So many of you may know that the FIDIC is the International Organization for Engineers, and they have the very renowned FIDIC template contracts. And so in November 2021, FIDIC published a climate change charter, and it aims really to include one of its objective, reduction of the carbon footprint in the industry, and it provides, a suite of support for climate change adaptation through the design of resilient infrastructure, And, FIDIC has recognized, the objective high on their agenda to achieve these goals in the construction industry, including, the supply chain, disruptions that we have witnessed as well during COVID. So I would really caution you, and, I guess less is more, that's one. And then do not hesitate at all to consult, industry leading guidelines and templates, which can be a very helpful starting point to when you're drafting these clauses.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Ahmed, I'm going to put you on the spot with the first question from Anonymous as well. In such a competitive industry, how can companies balance the need to protect their IP with transparent ESG reporting? 1 minute.
Certainly, thank you very much. There is no contradiction between both. Each company can protect their intellectual property and should protect their intellectual property, and at the same time complying with the transparency with respect to ESG. When you transparency with respect to ESG means that you publish the objectives or what you're doing in general without going in details and disclosing on intellectual property to investors or to others. So, and if you're to do this, you need first to protect your intellectual property. So there's no contradiction between both. There's a way to balance between both. And if you're not sure, consult with your lawyers.
Last question. Thank you, Anonymous. You're very active today. We do appreciate that. I'm going to throw this to Francis. As architects and designers, we can easily understand the greenwash, but also it has been used as a marketing tool rather than its main aim. How can we change that? I think, how can we change the narrative between greenwash and become more authentic? 1 minute.
1 minute. I think authenticity is one of those sort of heavily charged words, isn't it? I mean, I think you've got to work out what's real and what's not real. I mean, I have a pretty good nose for what's greenwash and what isn't. I think going back to one of the previous questions, if something's hardwired in the contract as a KPI, that's not a new thing. KPI regimes have existed for decades and decades, centuries probably. And as Sarah says, some of the bigger organizations like FIDIC are catching up with net zero and so on and so forth, and it's reflected in Chancery Lane drafting. So hardwiring things and making them smart, making them measurable, making them auditable, making them kind of things that people can stand behind. That's important. I mean, I think green willing doesn't really cut it anymore. So it's really about hardwiring and good drafting, as Sarah says. Clear, clean, crisp, sensible drafting that doesn't leave much room for ambivalence is the name of the game. That's what we do. But there is a lot of bad drafting out there. There's a lot of overly complex drafting, and it's a journey as well, isn't it? It's a spectrum. So not everybody is going to be looking at net zero completely on day one. I mean, countries aren't. We were looking at that list in terms of what their date targets are. A lot of them are 2050, 2060 in some cases. Companies will be on a similar trajectory, but you need to start the journey. You need to start thinking about, well, what can we do? What baby steps can we take? And there's a wealth of resources out there for people. And we, as a business, we've done the same thing. So anyway, that was it.
Thanks, Francis. So, to keep up with the theme of Sarah, keep it short and simple. I think I need to start thanking the panelists. Otherwise, I'm going to have my managers blowing in my neck here as well. So thank you very much, Francis, Ahmed, and Sarah, for your time and contributions. I truly appreciate that. You've shown us that there's a great room for optimism, innovation, and agency, and that it can go a very long way. To you, the audience, specifically Anonymous, thank you for sharing your thoughts and questions. I think we can all agree that we have learned much today, and all that is left to do is to walk the talk. Thank you very much. Over to you, Nwendo.
Well, nothing more to add, but to re-echo what Dr. Marlina said. I think I'd like to thank our panel for such an interesting discussion, and also to thank the audience for their participation. As you can see on the screen, we've got the QR code, which you can scan and see all the previous events that we've held. And we'll keep you updated on upcoming events that we'll be organizing. So it's just left for me to say good day, and you may now disconnect. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.